Hey everyone, it's Andrew. Welcome back to my channel on Everything Books. Today we're going to be discussing part 1 of the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Before we get started, I did want to discuss my general plan when reviewing this book, which is a little bit different than my past reviews. And that's really that because this book's so long, I'm going to break it up into separate sections. And so in part 1 today, we're going to be discussing the beginning of the book all the way out to when Edmund Dantes finds the treasure. And so we'll just discuss a general plot summary and my impressions of the book so far. For those of you that are watching, there will be a lot of spoilers for this, so if you don't want to continue watching this or having this content spoiled, as far as reading the book, you might want to skip this video, but for those of you that are okay with it, just continue watching and we'll just get started. So this book, the backdrop, it's really important to know that this book revolves around the time in France when King Louis XVIII has just come back into power after exiling Napoleon Bonaparte, who was previously emperor, to the Isle of Elba. And the story really revolves around Edmund Dantes, who's a 19-year-old sailor. It starts off with him essentially being on the second mate on the Pharaon, which is a trade ship for this fleet owned by Monsieur Morel. And on his 3-month voyage, where it starts off and he's returning to port, the prior captain, Leclerc, passes away because he's like feverish and dies on the ship. And his last dying wish is to have Edmund take a parcel over to the Isle of Elba, where Napoleon Bonaparte is exiled, and deliver it there in exchange for a letter. He receives this letter and he's instructed to take it to Paris. Edmund, not knowing really about the political situation, the situation with Bonaparte, essentially is just fulfilling this last wish for his dying captain without knowing the political realm around it. And so he comes back to port, did this 3-month voyage, and Monsieur Morel is really impressed. And because the Pharaon doesn't have a captain, Monsieur Morel essentially says to Edmund that he did such a great job that he's going to take over being captain for the ship, which is a huge accomplishment for somebody 19 years old and a sailor, because he's going to have more money, he's going to have a steady job and income and things like that. Meanwhile, he's also aspiring or in the process of getting married to the love of his life, Mercedes, who her parents passed away. She has no money, she's just beautiful, and he loves her, and he's planning on marrying her. He asks Monsieur Morel when he arrives in port to go on leave to essentially marry Mercedes at this time. Meanwhile, while this is all happening, there's a second person on the ship named Danglars, who's essentially responsible for the cargo, and he was aspiring to become captain as well. But hearing that Edmund is going to be captain, he's really kind of infuriated by this and upset, and they've had a lot of conflict in the past. And Edmund ideally would try to get rid of Danglars based on their past experience, but Monsieur Morel really likes Danglars, so Edmund essentially agrees to keep Danglars on the ship out of respect for Monsieur Morel. The other aspect is, so now he comes home, he meets Mercedes, they've been gone for a while, and they're planning on getting married. However, Mercedes has a cousin whose name is Fernand, who has been in love with Mercedes the entirety of their life and really wants to marry Mercedes. However, Mercedes, it's really the story of unrequited love, where Mercedes doesn't love Fernand, essentially says, you have no shot with me, and that if anything were to happen to Edmund, I'd essentially jump off a cliff and kill myself in the process, and I would never marry you. Which is really hurtful to Fernand, and he's really upset about this. And knowing that Edmund has finally arrived and they're planning on getting married, he essentially is losing all opportunity at marrying Mercedes, who he really loves a lot. And so he's kind of upset, sad, and melancholy about this situation. So those are the 3 characters there. And then there's a separate guy named Caderousse, who's essentially, I guess, like a tradesman that I guess competes with Monsieur Morel to a certain extent. He's just kind of this guy that's in the story in the beginning. From that backdrop, as this is happening, Edmund essentially is planning this engagement party with Mercedes within the upcoming days. And the night prior to this, Fernand, Caderousse, and Danglars meet up, and essentially they're just drinking, and They come up with this plot because Danglars observed that Edmund went to the Isle of Elba where Napoleon is located, that he came back with this letter, and he says that this guy who's taking over the ship and taking over my ability to become captain, we can essentially write this letter and say that he went to the Isle of Elba and he's a Bonapartiste, and he's in with Napoleon, and he's committing treason against the king. And they kind of are like just partying and drunk, and they make this and they write the letter, and Caderousse and Danglars essentially crumple up the letter and throw it off into the corner. However, Fernand, being so upset, essentially takes the letter and he sends it off ultimately. And he essentially sends it to the magistrate of the area that's responsible for like the police at the time. And so the next day, Edmund, not like being kind of like innocent and not knowing the situation, invited all three of these people to the engagement party, and they're having this party, and then all of a sudden the police come in, and the police come in and arrest Edmund out of nowhere, not knowing what he did or how he did it or anything. He's just thinking like maybe there was some like smuggled goods on the boat that I wasn't really sure of. He gets arrested and taken away at this engagement party. Immediately on this, it introduces this separate character, Villefort, who's the magistrate and kind of like this lawyer person responsible at this time. He's like I would say a district attorney at the time. He essentially comes in and he's at his engagement party to Renee. These are the political people of France at the time. And Villefort's young, he's an aspiring lawyer, he wants to become an important person in France, and so he sees this opportunity to take out all this on another Bonapartiste and put him in jail, and he essentially sees the opportunity, leaves his engagement party and meets up with Edmund Dantes as he's getting arrested to essentially read him his crime and things like that. Edmund coming in essentially just tells the story like my dying captain gave me this last wish. I went to the Isle of Elba. They gave me this letter. They sent it to I was instructed to go to Paris. Villefort is like, oh, there's nothing of this. You're definitely innocent. There's nothing I'll get you out of this. No, there's no problem there. However, when Villefort reads the actual letter, it's addressed to this guy named Noirtier, and Noirtier in Paris ends up being Villefort's dad. So Villefort, aspiring to be a royalist and be upcoming in society at that time, essentially sees like, one, this is incriminating my dad and I'll have to essentially put him to death for what he's done, but two, it's going to undermine my entire career. So he reads the letter. He essentially says, Edmund, I'm going to burn this letter because it's the only thing against you at this time, and don't say anything to anybody else about Noirtier or who this letter was addressed to. He promises Edmund that he's going to escape, he's going to be freed, and so Edmund is taken off to the Ministry of Justice and ultimately thrown in to prison at the Chateau d'If, which is essentially this island prison in the middle of the ocean, purely for like political prisoners who have committed some crime where they just want to put him away and never think about him again. And they put Edmund into the Chateau d'If. He doesn't know what his crime's for. The first couple days just kind of sitting there like, oh, I'll get out of here. However, that doesn't happen. And then he lashes out against like the person that comes to him in his cell and gets put further into the dungeon, in the bottom of the dungeon. And he's like screaming like, I want to see the like person responsible to know what I did, why I committed this crime, but that doesn't happen. The story kind of takes this transition where the whole plan in the letter was really revolving around the fact that Napoleon was planning on coming back to France and overthrowing the king. So ultimately Napoleon does that. About 3 days later, he comes back to Paris. He goes through like Lyon and I think it was like Provence, where they are Bonapartists, they support Bonaparte, and he goes straight into Paris with an army and essentially takes over the government. And he takes it over for 100 days, and meanwhile the king is exiled, but the king comes back later on. But during this time period, Villefort stays in power, essentially gets in this position where he's now part of the Bonapartiste government because Noirtier was involved and it's his father. Morel asks like, hey, can you get him out? And because Napoleon is now in power, like what Edmund Dantes did is no longer a threat to the government because the king's not in power. So Villefort writes another letter essentially saying like, yeah, this is what he did. And it essentially says like, you are guilty in the essence of like, you were responsible for assisting Bonaparte and you should be out. However, and like Monsieur Morel signs the letter, however, it just kind of gets like sent away as a petition and gets dropped and nothing happens of it. Edmund's still stuck in prison. But Villefort stays in power, and then as this is happening, it kind of transitions where Bonaparte is overthrown again and the King Louis XVIII comes back into power, which essentially solidifies the fact that Edmund was guilty per se, and he's kind of like stuck in the prison. That story kind of happens, and Mercedes is devastated. Edmund Dantes' father is devastated and ultimately dies because he's impoverished and things like that. And Fernand essentially is in this supportive role where he's trying to like betroth and get married to Mercedes just by being like the guy on the side that supports her when she's upset. And then Danglars ultimately takes over the Pharaon because Edmund is no longer there. So the Pharaon needs a captain, and Monsieur Morel puts Danglars into power. So Danglars benefits, and Fernand assumedly benefits, and Mercedes is devastated. Edmund's dad is dead, essentially, and Edmund gets sent off into prison. While Edmund is in prison, it starts off with him kind of like just suffering and miserable, being all alone. And at one point, he's contemplating the idea of suicide, either by hanging himself or starving himself to death. He chooses to stop eating, and he no longer eats at all. And while he's sitting there, actually losing consciousness, he hears in the wall this scraping noise and sound, and he's like, what the heck is that? Like, it's definitely a prisoner, like trying to get out. And if that's the case, I might be able to get freed. So he decides on his like last breath, and as he's like passing out, to eat. And then he makes this noise in the wall and bangs it, and he realizes like the noise of the grinding stops. So it's definitely a prisoner. And so then all of a sudden he decides like, hey, I'm gonna scratch at this wall and see if I can dig a hole and find this prisoner, because one, I'm alone, but two, that might be a way to escape and get out of here because I'm so miserable. And so he does that, and he takes away some of the wall, and he basically gets over, there's the cell next door has this guy named Abbé Ferrier, who's this old guy that essentially got in prison like 4 years prior to Edmund. They consider him a madman because he basically goes to every governor that comes in and says, I'll give you 5 million francs and you can set me free, and I'll tell you exactly where the treasure is, because I have this treasure, and you can go there and I won't even try to escape in the meantime, and if you find the treasure, I'll give it to you, and as long as you set me free. And so they think he's mad though, because he's been there, he's an old guy, he's like this really smart guy that's like working on Archimedes problems on the walls and things like that. But so they just take him as a madman. This madman, Abbé Ferrier, is essentially digging underneath the ground, and Edmund kind of like digs towards him over his hole, and essentially they meet paths. Edmund being so lone and miserable, essentially this human contact is what makes him survive in the prison, and they become super close friends. Essentially he sees him as a father figure because he's much older, in his like 50s, 60s. The Abbé Ferrier essentially tells him his backstory, where he was like an aide to Cardinal Spada, which essentially was a cardinal in Italy at the time, who was extremely wealthy. And they give the backstory, but he basically was killed by the Pope in Italy, in Rome, and this Cardinal Spada had a huge mass of money that, knowing that he was going to be killed by being poisoned by the Pope, wrote a will to his nephew. However, this will gets lost. It can never be found. His inheritance, like people inherit like his home and his estate, which wasn't really substantive as far as money at the time. And they can never find this will, and he was supposed to be super wealthy, but they can't find it. The lineage passes through the abbey being like supportive or like a servant to the last owner of the Spada family, essentially has everything passed on to him at the death of like the last family member. And so he's got all these, like he's got a huge library, he's got wealth in the fact of like his estate and things like that, and he's well learned. He's like considered a Renaissance man, I would say. He knows everything. He knows science, he knows multiple languages, he knows everything. And he essentially, while they're in prison with Edmund, teaches Edmund all that knowledge. and he goes through it, and they spend 2 years just going through all that knowledge. Meanwhile, they're digging this hole, and they're trying to get out of the prison in preparation for Edmund leaving and trying to escape the prison. While this is happening, though, Edmund and Monsieur Ferrier, or Abbe Ferrier, essentially talk about the circumstances in which Edmund was imprisoned. He essentially says Fernand probably betrayed you for Mercedes, and Danglars probably betrayed you to become a captain on the ship. And ultimately, he puts the connection that Villefort, he kind of hears that the letter was written to this guy named Noirtier. And the Abbé knew of a Noirtier whose last name was de Villefort. And so all of a sudden, Edmund essentially finds out that Fernand, Danglars, and Villefort essentially betrayed him and imprisoned him despite his innocence and put him to jail. And he kind of commits in his mind that he is going to get out of here and seek revenge against them in any way possible because they essentially did this to him. This Abbé Ferrier, he essentially probably has epilepsy or strokes. And it's like a family history of it or something, and he had like one fit in the past, but while he's in prison, the Abbey essentially has another fit where as they're trying to escape and dig a hole out of the prison where they were going to dig into a courtyard and essentially escape from there, the Abbey has this fit where he has some sort of epilepsy or stroke, and he can no longer use his right arm and his leg. And so he can no longer escape the prison, and Edmund essentially promises that he will not leave or escape the prison until the Abbey passes away because he loves him like a father and doesn't want to leave him. In preparation for another fit happening, ultimately the Abbé Ferrier tells Edmund of this treasure. He came across this letter, the last will of this cardinal family, the Spada family, and one night he was in this library, he was trying to figure out what the will was, and he just lit this piece of paper that was like passed on in this scroll kind of piece, and all of a sudden like he saw text on it. He puts it out and half the thing's burned. The letter essentially says like where this treasure is buried, and it's essentially the will that the cardinal was essentially trying to pass on to his nephew for the money. It says that the money's on the Isle of Monte Cristo and that it's buried, and the amount of it's probably like 15 million francs, which is an exorbitant amount of money. Abbé Ferrier essentially is not going to get out of here. In preparation for him potentially having a third fit and dying, he tells Edmund about this treasure and gives him the location and the idea, and he says commit this will to memory so that even if you don't have it, you know where it's going to be. And so with this in mind, Edmund essentially puts everything together where he's going to escape, he's going to dig his way out. Once Abbé Ferrier dies, he's going to swim to a nearby island because Chateau d'If's in the middle of the ocean, and then he's going to get this treasure and exact revenge against Danglars, Fernand, and Villefort for what they did to him. Meanwhile, while this is happening, while he's like waiting, the Chateau d'If essentially builds a new segment of the prison overlying where they were trying to escape. So they essentially lost hope of getting out simply because they built it and there's no way out of that way. In Abbé Ferrier's death, the Chateau d'If, what they do to their prisoners that die is essentially they put them in a sack, tie a rope to their legs, and then throw them into the ocean, and that's like the cemetery for Chateau d'If. It's the middle of the ocean on the bottom of the ocean floor. And so after Edmund like scurries away to kind of get back to his cell after the Abbey dies, he comes back, sees him in the sack, and he says, hey, I have an opportunity. So he takes his body, drags him back to his cell, and then he hops in this sack with a knife and is like, all right, they're gonna bury me alive and I'll dig my way out, or if they find out, I'll kill them or whatever. And so they start carrying him out. They tie this rope to his legs, they put a cannon shot on his leg, and then they throw him off a cliff like 50-60 feet down into the middle of the ocean, which is terrifying. And it's like, will he survive? And I'm like, in the middle of the book while I'm reading this, I'm like, he's got to survive because it's like 1,000 pages more and it's only 200 pages, so he's going to live. But so they throw him off, he lands in the water, and then he cuts himself loose out of the sack, and then he cuts his feet loose, and then he's in the middle of the ocean. But as this is happening, he shrieked, and he looks to the shore, and he sees like a light still, and he's like wondering if they hurt him or not, and so he dives under the water and comes up, and then essentially they aren't there. and so he's free. However, the nearest island that's uninhabited is 3 miles. It's the middle of the ocean. And he's like, what the heck am I going to do? How am I going to get there? And so he starts swimming into the middle of the ocean, and there's a lighthouse on one side, so he uses that as a frame of reference, and he essentially just keeps on swimming. He's like dying because he didn't eat much, he didn't drink much, and he's exhausted. And then all of a sudden he like feels something on his foot, and he realizes it's ground, and he landed on one of the local islands. Immediately he's like, oh, this is the wrong island, I gotta swim to a separate island. However, this huge storm comes in, and for some reason they have like a bunch of sailors just crash on this, or like there's sailors or smugglers in the ship, and during the storm he witnesses them crash, and all of them like die. They don't come to shore or anything like that. However, he sees one of the hats of one of the sailors. He's like, I'll take it, like, and then he sees a ship in the distance during the day, and he's like, all right, I'm going to take this hat, I'm going to take a log, and I'm going to swim out to the ship and try to get on. So that's exactly what he does. He gets out there, he gets to the ship, and then he basically says, I'm the sailor that like got thrown over, or like our ship broke and everybody died and I survived. And he comes onto the ship, and because he was previously a sailor and he's very well skilled at what he does, knowing that he was on the Pharaon and the second mate to the Pharaon, it's a smuggler ship, and he helps them out and maneuvers the ship really well. And they essentially say, hey, you can help us out, and maybe we'll give you some money and you can pay your way as far as food and clothing and things like that until we can get you wherever you need to go. So that first day, they start riding towards Chateau d'If, and while they're riding there, all of a sudden they hear guns and cannons going off, which is essentially an alarm that somebody escaped. Edmund's like, oh, that's what it is. And they kind of, like, the people on the ship essentially kind of say, hey, you don't look like a sailor, you've got this like 6-inch long beard, your hair's all unkempt and stuff like that. And they kind of hint that they understand that he probably was the prisoner that escaped Chateau d'If. However, because he's so good and they're on a smuggler ship, they're not going to just drive up to the Chateau d'If and drop him off, because then they're caught and they're in trouble. So they essentially go out into the Mediterranean, smuggling their way and things like that. So he starts helping them out, being extremely well as a sailor, and helps them out with multiple ships. And while they're doing that, he rides right past the Isle of the Count of Monte Cristo where this treasure is, and he's looking at it and he's like, all I have to do is get there. But he spent 14 years in prison seeking his revenge, seeking his money, seeking all like the treasure and things like that. So he's like, I'm going to be patient, I'm just going to wait. They drive past it. He rides past it like 20 times on different smuggling missions and things like that, where they kind of trade things in the middle of the night. And one day they all of a sudden come up with the idea that we're going to stop at the Isle de Count de Monte, or Isle de Monte Cristo for this smuggling route, and we'll come off there and exchange things at that time. So they end up stopping on the Monte Cristo, and Edmund is like, okay, I'll go ashore, I'll kill a goat and get food for you. And there's a sailor on the ship named Jacopo, who Jacopo kind of is very entrusting and really likes Edmund because of his superiority as far as his knowledge, skill, things like that. Promises to come with Edmund ashore to help him out in case anything happens. So Edmund's like, oh gosh, Jacopo's coming with me. I can't find the treasure if he comes here, so I'll have to find out some way to get rid of him. So he kills a goat. He essentially hands it off to Jacopo and says, go bring it back, light a fire, start cooking it, and then fire a gun when you're ready, because I'll come back at that time. Meanwhile, while this is happening, Edmund scurries around the island, essentially finds like these human traces on the island where like it's just man-made things there, and it ultimately leads him to this path where there's this giant huge boulder in the middle of the ground, just standing upright out of the ground, and there's nothing around it, there's no other tracks or traces around it, and he's like, maybe this is where the treasure's buried. But as this is happening, he hears a gunfire off, and he's like, oh crap, I gotta go back to the ship and eat. And while he's doing that, he essentially turns around and he falls like 12-15 feet, has bloody knee, he hurts his knee and can't move or anything like that. And he's like in utter agony, can't move. Jacopo's freaking out because he's hurt now, and he's like, how could I let this happen? So this is all going on, but the smugglers on the ship essentially say, we got to move along, we got to get to our trade route so that we're not late. And so Edmund kind of proposes the idea of like, leave me on the island, give me a gun, give me some gunpowder, give me some food, some rum, and a pickaxe, and I'll just sit here and you guys can come back in 6 to 7 days and just pick me up along the way. And they're like kind of worried about him, but they're like, you'll just survive. And he's like, I'll just sit around, because he's hurt and he can't do anything and it's going to be too painful to get back on the ship. However, Edmund essentially just fakes this, and he's not hurt at all, and essentially he takes all this and he goes back to that rock, like kind of figures it out and like digs a hole with the pickaxe underneath it, and like doesn't really see anything. He reaches his arm in, can't get underneath it, but then he decides to take the gunpowder that they gave him and he basically explodes this rock into multiple pieces, and it opens up into this crevice, and there's like, I guess, bugs and snakes coming out and stuff like that. But ultimately, like, he goes into this crevice, like gets rid of the rocks, and he enters this cavern. And the cavern's empty. And he's like, oh gosh, where's all the gold? Where's the treasure? Did the Abbé Ferrier, was he a madman after all? And was I just like misled? However, on the will, it is said essentially that the treasure is going to be in the second cavern. So he looks around the whole thing and he doesn't see a second cavern, and then he starts knocking on the walls, and there's one area where it's more hollow than the rest, but he's like, I don't know, maybe there's a second place. So he knocks entirely around the walls, and this is the only hollow place. And then he starts banging it with the pickaxe, and like there's stucco there, and there's unnatural rock there, and he opens up into a second cavern. And the cavern's also empty. And he's like, uh-oh, where's the treasure? And so he looks around, and then he starts digging, and he's digging in this one corner, and then all of a sudden he hears a thud, and a metallic thud. He's like, wait, there's something here. However, because he's so worried about their ships or somebody else coming in and capturing him with this treasure or seeing him with this treasure, he goes out of the cave, goes back up, there's nobody there, then he comes back down, and then he digs out this box and essentially has the Spada crest on it. And he's like, oh my gosh, this is the treasure. And then he opens it, and there's gold coins, there's gold ingots, there's diamonds, there's emeralds, there's like huge amount of money, and all of a sudden he has $15 million worth of francs, or 15 million francs as far as his wealth, going from nothing to everything in like one fell swoop, and he has all the wealth he could ever need to exact his revenge, live out his life, and do whatever he needs. So he counts it all up, and he goes back up, makes sure knows that he's there, and then he takes some of the money, and then he covers it back up. And that is going to be part one of the book. So the reason why I stopped here with the book review, essentially because this is a good stopping point with the storyline. And so that's a general synopsis of the story today. It covers everything. There are minute details and things like that, but so far this book, it's, I guess, chapters 1 to 25. I think this book is phenomenal. The storyline essentially encompasses everything you could need for a book. It has like treasure, it has prison, it has revenge, it has people like getting out and ruining people's lives. It has like, it's intense. And so far as part one up until now, I'm super excited to read the rest of it. And what we'll do is I'm going to just read the rest of this book, and we'll just kind of break up like the next parts of it as I go along throughout it. But for those of you that have not read this, I highly recommend it because this book is just phenomenal. I don't really have any complaints of it so far. It's an easy read. It's a quick read. I'm like 250 pages in like one weekend without even thinking about it. So that's really all I have for this book review so far, just because I haven't finished the book. I did read parts of this book back when I was in French class in high school, where we read like English and French and then watched the movies. So I have a general inkling of what's going to happen, and I'm super excited in anticipation of what's going to happen, because we know Edmund Dantes is going to seek his revenge and get back at everybody, but I do not know the details of how exactly he does that. And there's going to be about 1,000 pages more to do that, which is kind of intimidating but exhilarating at the same time. So that's essentially all I have for part one of the Count of Monte Cristo. It's a good plot summary. It's a good book. If you have not read it, you can definitely pick this up. This is the Barnes & Noble edition. I got it for like 15 bucks from Barnes & Noble. So if you're interested in reading it, you can pick it up, start reading this, and then maybe you could read along and post comments below and see if your general impressions are the same. But that's really all I have. If you have any questions, comments, anything like that, please post them below. And that's my first part 1 of the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas.